Ever since the end of World War II showed the entire world the devastating power of nuclear energy and weapons, humanity has been obsessed with it. Be that creating massive nuclear power plants to power entire cities, making ever more destructive weapons like Tsar Bomba, which can level a mountain, or making fictional characters based around the idea. One of the most famous characters ever made around this idea was Godzilla, created for pretty much the purpose of being a symbolic metaphor for nuclear warfare and its effects on pretty much everything. Though since then he's changed a lot, gone from a character that was only really made by Toho to a character that has many fan interpretations, like Lordverse Godzilla. And he's also went on to inspire other characters, like Nucleonics. These two characters, both based around Godzilla, one of which was literally just Godzilla, but fan-made, and the other one being very clearly inspired by him, will be going up against each other today in a fight to the death. Starting off with Lordverse Godzilla, standing around 400 feet tall and over 80,000 metric tons, Lordverse Godzilla is the king of the monsters, much like many other Godzilla interpretations are. The son of former king of the monsters Dagon and his mate Rozan, Godzilla is a powerhouse in his verse. He's strong enough to take on other alpha-level titans and was able to beat Mechagodzilla with some difficulty, but once he's supercharged, it was not exactly hard. Though not yet as strong as his father was, he's certainly not a pushover. Like all Godzillas, he's able to use the atomic breath, which is described as essentially a laser-like beam of radioactive plasma, though its properties could change depending on what he absorbs in order to amplify himself, or was feeding off of prior. Meaning if he absorbs some types of radiation, the beam may turn green. If he absorbs other types of radiation, he may just get a stronger variant of it, something similar to the red spiral ray. And in a burning state, he would gain access to the infinite heat ray, which is a whole other animal, but I'll get into that later. Regardless, the atomic breath is an extremely powerful attack that can be amplified multiple times over depending on which version he's using, from a normal to a slightly amped to a full-on supercharged or blue spiral ray. All of these attacks are obviously damaging, but the power difference is very noticeable. Enemies that don't take much damage from the standard atomic breath could be instantly one-shotted by a blue spiral ray. So there's definitely a noticeable gap there. Godzilla can also amplify parts of himself to deal extra damage in melee, such as his hands, feet, tail, etc. And despite dwarfing pretty much any real-life animal by a massive margin, he's pretty agile as well, capable of jumping, running, and basically doing whatever he wants mobility-wise. He can even fly with the atomic breath, similar to Showa Godzilla. So I suppose agility like that isn't too surprising given he literally descends from the most agile megatheropod to ever exist. Godzilla can also absorb energy directly from enemy attacks, any sort of radiation, be it ionized or just nuclear. Any radiation really, he can absorb. And it doesn't even just need to be radiation, stuff like cosmic rays, energy directly from black holes, etc. All things that a Godzilla can absorb, even if it's an attack directed straight at him. There's also multiple references by Dinomania herself that imply that he should have some level of relativity to Heisei Godzilla. Of course, she's also stated he would lose a fight to him, but even being somewhat similar to abilities would mean he could absorb energy on a higher dimensional level as well, which would be consistent as some of his villains, like Ghidorah, straight up use higher dimensional energy. Godzilla also possesses the Nuclear Pulse, a close-range attack somewhat similar to the atomic breath, just instead of shooting a beam out, he simply unleashes a massive wave of radiation around him. He can also modify this into an EMP pulse as well, somewhat similar to what the Mutos have in the Monsterverse. And just like his parents, he has extremely effective regeneration, able to regenerate from almost anything. Massive hits to eternal organs, even attacks directly to his brain, wouldn't kill him so long as his secondary brain is still active. Now, his secondary brain, located on the lower part of his spinal cord, if hit, can severely weaken his regeneration and potentially even lead to his death if he's hit with another powerful attack right after. Though it's not like it shuts it off completely, just heavily weakens it. Somewhat similar to what happened to Heisei Godzilla and Godzilla vs. Godzilla 2. Seeing as the two have a lot of similarities in biology. But Godzilla isn't just flashy abilities, he's fairly skilled as well. He's fought a multitude of enemies, from Mutos to a mechanized copy of himself to Ghidorah. Though we haven't seen the Ghidorah fight yet, we can assume that he's in a similar tier to Ghidorah due to the category system that Dynamania has set up for the kaiju. And from some of the statements of stuff that we know will happen in the fight, we know he at bare minimum can damage Ghidorah in his base and supercharged states to some degree. So, how powerful is Ghidorah and other kaiju that he's fought? Well, the Mutos are kind of weak. Not really that weak in comparison to some other kaiju in history, but compared to Godzilla himself, they're not exactly impressive. Mechagodzilla, on the other hand, just kind of scales to Godzilla. He's not as strong as Godzilla, as he lost and was only really comparable to base Godzilla. But still, Exilian technology is incredibly impressive technology, and these are the same people that had a stronger Ghidorah in the past. So, if they think this guy's a valuable weapon, he's obviously pretty powerful. And then we have Ghidorah. Ghidorah is stated to be comparable directly to Void Ghidorah. The Void Ghidorah that I'm talking about being the one from the anime trilogy. I do not believe Dynamania was talking about the one from his little cameo in a novel, but if she was, that would change the power system pretty bad, but I don't believe that's the case here. Void Ghidorah is an entity that controls an entire infinite realm above space-time in the base Godzilla universe, which is fourth dimensional, and controls that infinite realm to the point where he can light the entire thing up in a second, if not even shorter, which would obviously be infinite speed. This is consistent with feats that we see Space Godzilla have in the Heisei manga, another thing that this Godzilla scales to, and also consistent with Heisei and Showa scaling in general, due to the many higher dimensional things that tend to pop up in those movies. It's not like this level of power is inconsistent with Dynamania's own statements or the verse itself's showings. Dynamania has confirmed these levels of power multiple times, and these general verse, though we've never seen a universe get obliterated on screen or anything, we've still seen Ghidorah casually move stars with a single gravity beam, and we've seen other characters take attacks that should scale to other attacks from other verses that would just generally be in that level of power. Of course, there's a big debate between if AP versus DC is actually something that should matter in Godzilla, but we know for a fact Lordverse controls his AP and his destructive capacity, same way Heisei does. So, at least in this instance, you can't really use the, well, they didn't destroy the whole city with that one attack, so therefore their building level argument when the character controls their AP the same way like a Dragon Ball character controls their ki. But all this is far from Godzilla's peak power. His absolute maximum level of power that he can get to, at least as of now, would be a burning form, similar to his mother's. With all Godzillas having essentially infinite energy capacity, you would assume that they couldn't reach a burning state, but they still can. Though their limits technically aren't finite, they still do hit a point of no return, where if they do not release all of their energy, or at least a lot of it, they will melt down and die. Most likely taking the planet, solar system, maybe even the universe or multiverse with them when they go. This is the power of Burning Godzilla. And Burning Godzilla should be comparable to the Heisei's Burning Godzilla, via Dynamania's own statements. So, how powerful is Godzilla in this state? The answer is terrifyingly more powerful than his earlier forms by a significant margin. Whereas Supercharged Godzilla is roughly in the multiversal category, somewhere around 5th dimensional, maybe 6th dimensional if you use higher ends off cross-scaling with the Heisei era. But Burning is a whole different animal. Burning Godzilla is a state that was above the Cosmic Amp, which itself was above Space Godzilla. Space Godzilla is a character that would have been above pretty much the Godzilla that Lordverse roughly scales to in the supercharged state, and well above Void Ghidorah as well. So if you go on this ladder, assuming that these go up whole dimensional levels, which Toho seems to imply they do, Burning Godzilla in the Lordverse would be multiple infinite levels above his prior forms. Extremely powerful, like potentially in the hyperversal tiers once he starts using the infinite heat ray if it works like the Heisei version, though typically around the multiversal range. So, what is Godzilla's maximum level? Well, we don't know how many infinite heat rays Godzilla can use, and we don't know if the infinite heat ray works identical to Heisei 1, though Dynamania seems to imply it might. So if we go off that, We assume the infinite heat ray does in fact add a boost similar to the red spiral ray from the cosmic amp, just switched over to this new form, which is above that. Godzilla could potentially reach levels of power above 12th dimensional, though on a more consistent end, he'd be around 9th. Regardless, though, that is insane levels of power. Like, more than enough to obliterate a multiverse, and more than enough to obliterate the 99.9% of fictional verses outright. So in the burning form, Godzilla not only has access to the infinite heat ray, which multiplies its power infinitely every use, and potentially even ups itself by whole dimensional level, seeing as it is above the red spiral ray, which is above an amp that technically did that. But burning Godzilla also has an amped up version of the nuclear pulse. His mother was capable of obliterating a lot of stuff with it, like a stupid amount of area was turned to nothing. And the burning form is so powerful that the ground beneath the user literally just melts away. Kaiju as powerful as Ghidorah, aka Destroya, couldn't even hurt Rozan when she was in this state, so Godzilla at this state would be so much above Ghidorah that it's unlikely he'd even be able to do damage. And Godzilla is still capable of absorbing energy in this state. This form isn't all wins though. Again, if they reach a point of no return and they don't release the energy fast enough, the user will enter meltdown and will die. Their death most likely taking out everything with them. The user of this form also can sustain injuries that will never heal even with the regeneration they have. Rozan has multiple stars from her form, and Godzilla could get potentially worse ones. Essentially, if you take enough damage in this form, your regeneration isn't saving you, even with it still basically in overdrive. And the heat produced by this form is potentially infinite as well, as Heisei Godzilla has arguments of potentially having infinite heat, and burning Godzilla in the Lordverse is just the same thing. In fact, this form's so powerful that Dynamania has even implied that Rozan from the Lordverse, who would be roughly comparable to burning Godzilla, in her own burning state, could fight Destroya from the Heisei era and potentially win. Though she didn't give a clear answer on who would win, the fact that Rozan could fight Destroya, one of the strongest Godzilla villains of all time, is pretty telling of how powerful this verse really is. With all that power, you'd assume Godzilla pretty much wouldn't lose, but that simply isn't the case. The Lordverse is a pretty complex verse, with many characters that Godzilla has to go up against, just having his own abilities. And characters like Ghidorah, though Godzilla could massively surpass him, Godzilla isn't always going to have access to the burning state, and using it is so risky that he probably wouldn't want to use it unless absolutely necessary, because it will put the user in a coma, typically. Best case scenario, actually. He saw what it did to his mother, and he might even be terrified to use the form itself, but I'm sure he would if he really needed to. So, in the question of how powerful Lordverse Godzilla is, he's definitely earned his title, I'll put it that way. Moving on to Nucleonics now. Standing over 500 feet tall and weighing over 200,000 metric tons, Nucleonics is the strongest kaiju Earth has ever seen. Well, at least the strongest kaiju from Earth that they've ever seen. Nucleonics is a mutated baryonyx, similar to Godzilla being an essentially mutated, evolved Tyrannosaurus Rex. Well, technically it's mutated Neo-baryonyx, it's confusing. I'm not going to get into how dinosaurs changed in the Xenoverse Kaiju War universe, it's complicated. Regardless though, Nucleonics is essentially just a really big baryonyx on nuclear god steroids. Unlike Godzilla, Nucleonics does not use radiation like the standard ionized nuclear, all that. His radiation is what is referred to as Neo-Gamma in verse. To explain what Neo-Gamma is, it's essentially drawing energy from a higher dimensional plane and forcing it into the lower dimensional plane that you're fighting on. Essentially, Nucleonics is just ripping energy out of a higher dimension above the standard space-time of his physical universe and blasting it at an opponent in a beam that somehow fits in that dimensional space. Though not technically radiation in the traditional sense, it still functions like radiation just on a higher level, and is still considered radioactive in verse, despite being sort of something entirely different at the same time. Nucleonics, like Godzilla, can also absorb energy, and by energy I mean pretty much any form of energy. Though he isn't very proficient at absorbing it from similarly powerful enemies attacking him, he can still drain a little bit of it. Not a whole beam or anything, but enough to keep him in the fight. He cannot, however, absorb infinite energy, at least not in his base state, though hypercharged and other forms stronger than that, like his soul fusion and light forms, can definitely do that. In his base state, if he hits a certain limit, he's either automatically going to transform into one of his transformations, or he's going to start basically melting. And even his regeneration won't be able to stop it. Speaking of his regeneration is pretty much insane. In his base state, his regeneration acts on a cellular level, and will act pretty much if he tells it to. Meaning if he's attacking, he can't force himself to heal automatically, he has to focus on one or the other. That is not the case in his hypercharged state, where everything's happening automatically. His power is rapidly multiplying itself, and he is rapidly healing automatically even when he's not hurt. His cells are rapidly replacing each other, and his energy is basically in overdrive. In Soul Fusion, it's much the same, except even his soul will start regenerating itself if it's damaged. And then once he enters the light form, his strongest transformation as of now, he can regenerate from anything from a simple atom to a speck of his own soul, making him nearly unkillable. Though regenerating from his soul does require him to have a link to the Dreamlands, something he normally wouldn't have. So normally he can regenerate from a single atom, but if he's destroyed on a subatomic level, he is pretty much dead. Though technically speaking he could reform the Dreamlands over time, it's unlikely he would survive that unless he had a link prior, as he would most likely be devoured by one of the entities in there. Unless he simply doesn't form in there, which would happen if he was kicked out of his light state at the time of his death, or if he wasn't at his maximum capacity. Also, if he died without having any energy left. So, his regeneration is powerful, but there's definitely flaws in it. His standard ability is his Nuclear Ray. Very similar to the Atomic Breath, it's a blast of basically Neo-Gamma fired directly from his mouth, caused by mutated organs from the Neo-Baryonyx genes that he has, being technically just a mutated version of one that essentially mutated a simpler attack that was essentially just a shocking bite into a full-on massive projectile attack. He can also fire this out as orbs or spear-like projectiles, though typically prefers just shooting a beam. He can also fire a beam from his tail called the Fusion Laser. This attack is technically more focused than the Nuclear Ray, though it isn't as commonly used by him, as it's more used for cutting than actually blasting enemies away, and he can channel more energy through his mouth than he can through his tail. He can also blast off several different variants of a pulse attack, which act very similar to the Nuclear Pulse. Typically he's not going to use these unless he's focused on like a melee only fight, as they drain more energy than the Nuclear Ray does, and typically they're going to do less damage as it's spread out rather than focused in one area. Nuclearonyx also possesses several man-made weapons on his armor, gifted to him by a subset of UN that essentially raised him after finding him. Nucleonics was mutated by a man-made weapon, the orbital grenade. This weapon was powerful enough that if it was fired at Japan, which was the reference they used when discussing its destructive capacity, it would have wiped out everything on the Japanese islands, down all the way through the Earth's crust on a subatomic level, and even into some of the mantle. This level of power is pretty absurd, but it only gets more insane from there. Nucleonics basically endured that and absorbed most of it when it was tested on his island first. To be fair, they had it focused where it would have only destroyed the island, but it would have destroyed it on a level below the subatomic level. But if it would have been at its full destructive capacity, it would still have been the same level of energy. And Nucleonics absorbed almost all of it, with Tyrantus also taking a small portion and several other animals on the island also absorbing some, but the island itself not taking too much damage, only being burned on the surface. Which is how they noticed something was definitely wrong. Nucleonics' parents were killed by a mix of that and a pre-mutated Tyrantus attacking them. Tyrantus being a giant Tyrannosaurus Rex kaiju from the same verse. Nucleonics' man-made weapons include muon cannons and tachyon cannons. These are the massive cannons that you see on his suit. Technically speaking, they fire a hybrid of tachyon and muon projectiles, though typically speaking it's more tachyon than muon. Regardless though, both of these are faster than light, super powerful laser-like projectiles that deal pretty decent damage to basically whatever they're hitting. He can amplify these with his own energy as well to fire Neo Gamma, though typically speaking he doesn't use these often unless he's fighting weaker opponents, as they're never going to be as strong as his standard nuclear ray. He also possesses his tail blade, which he uses to help channel the fusion laser, which he technically could fire prior to having it, but it fired through multiple spikes on his tail and was far less effective, acting more like a bunch of flames than a single beam. Regardless though, this blade is made out of extremely powerful cursed metal, made from the Church of the Harbinger, essentially Cthulhu worshippers. This metal is actually more durable than he is and gets stronger through Neo Gamma energy, meaning it is very unlikely to break, and if it's breaking, he's probably already dead. It could also cut through basically anything he's hitting. As if that wasn't enough, he also has access to a bunch of anti-kaiju missiles, typically used for weaker opponents like the Harvester Invasion or the Church of the Harbingers, many mechanical kaiju. Though he doesn't use these on bigger opponents, sometimes he will, just as a distraction to get a good hit in. These attacks are usually not what he's going for. He does have stronger stuff though through his transformations. When hypercharged, he could fire an amped up version of the nuclear ray, pouring far more energy into it and basically ripping through even more dimensions to draw in even more power. Though it's unclear if this actually makes the dimensionality of the attack higher, it's most likely not what's going on. It's most likely ripping into multiple dimensions on the same dimensional level to multiply the power, not necessarily drawing in a whole higher dimension or multiple higher dimensions. As for his other abilities, he can fly in hypercharged and in base, though in base he has to rely on man-made jets on his suit, whereas in hypercharged and above, he can fly through essentially telekinesis, though he can still use the jets amped up on Neo Gamma to basically amp his flight even further. He can also enter the soul fusion state. Due to a merging of his soul with a fraction of Mistosauros, a kaiju ally of his, he gains extra abilities, including an amped up version of Neo Gamma that is orange in color, and absolute zero energy. When combined, he's able to hit an opponent with absolute heat and absolute cold. Now by absolute heat, I don't mean the real life absolute heat, which is a finite number. I mean the absolute heat within his verse, aka infinite heat, as well as absolute zero at the same time, essentially a back and forth between the two. These beams don't actually cancel each other out, as they're focused kind of like the AP of the attack. I mean, the cold and heat don't actually interact until they hit the target, and once that happens, it's still gonna hurt extremely bad, as you're getting hit with pretty much the coldest possible temperature and heat that physically shouldn't exist, all backed up by immense amounts of higher dimensional energy. This attack has had multiple names within the canon. Its current name is the Burning Blizzard attack, or the Burning Blizzard Ray. Either way, this attack is an extremely powerful super move, essentially, that can essentially one-shot most of the enemies in Verse. His first time using it, he was able to knock Lordverse basically infinite distance away. Lordverse being a biological son of Cthulhu, who is one of the strongest enemies, if not the strongest enemy he's ever fought up to this point, only really challenged by supernatural hyper demons like Krampus. Yes, that Krampus. But even with all that, that is still not Nucleonics' limit. His true limit, and his true maximum power, is through a pretty unique ability of his within his verse. See, everything inside the Cineverse Kaiju verse is somewhat based on the Lovecraftian lore, and everything in Lovecraftian lore is directly connected to Yog-Sothoth, the god of the verse, essentially. In Cineverse Kaiju War, there's entities very similar to this, referred to pretty commonly as just the light, or light itself. Though not literally light, it is essentially the form it chooses, just light. This entity is within everything in the verse for the most part, meaning it has absolute control over everyone and everything. Nucleonics is the only exception to this, as his soul broke free of it. This happened when Nucleonics was being attacked by Lordverse, and Lordverse attempted to dominate his mind through linking him directly to his father, Cthulhu. Cthulhu attempted to essentially control Nucleonics. However, Nucleonics overpowered this through sheer willpower, and the force of doing so, as well as the soul fusion shortly after, was enough to essentially break his connection with everything else in the cosmology. be it through magic or sheer will, he became essentially an infant version of the light. His soul now unconnected to anything within the cosmology, taking the opposite color of the light, which is typically yellow, now a dark blue, and essentially having the most potential at anything in the verse. Though he hasn't mastered this at all yet, and hasn't even entered the light form in canon, though he certainly could, this essentially puts him on the same level as very powerful other gods when they're in their physical form, while he's in the physical world. This would put him on the same level of power as Cthulhu for the most part, and is also what would allow him to get a connection to the Dreamlands and enhance his power further beyond that. His power should surpass most entities in the verse that aren't past the physical realms. Essentially anything that's not Dreamlands or higher is probably weaker than him currently. So what does having this new power give him? Well, he should be comparable to other gods, who can create infinite realms casually, just like archdemons, but to an even higher degree. Can multiply their power massively, fly, bend space-time, warp reality, and pretty much do whatever they want, so long as they have the energy to do it. Essentially, in this state, he's at his maximum. His power would also slowly adapt to opponents, even opponents rising in dimensionality. Though, he cannot adapt to opponents rising in dimensionality at a very fast pace, as, well, he still has limits. His body is still very much mortal, despite having a soul that is essentially the strongest in the verse. So, with all that, how powerful is Nucleonics? Well, just like Lordverse Godzilla, he certainly earns his title. He is the strongest creature that Earth has ever seen, and will likely continue to be so for the continuation of his verse, unless something happens. And there you have it. Some people are probably either not surprised or very surprised with that outcome. So let me break this down through a couple categories. Starting off with speed. I didn't really go too far into this with their rundowns, but Lordverse Godzilla definitely has a speed edge over Nucleonics. Let's just look at what they scale to. Nucleonics, on average, even as a juvenile, could react to light speed attacks and faster than light speed attacks, like Tyrantus's tachyon beams. But as he got older, he was able to react to far faster things, such as Lordverse and Xenorax, both of which can fly around infinite space and finite time, infinite speed. So he should be at least infinite speed, and he can get even higher as he can react and should be comparable to characters like Cthulhu and Lordverse when he's at his best, both of which can travel in and out of the Dreamlands. Though he wouldn't scale to their Dreamland selves, as he himself has never even drawn power from it, and he's never fought them at that level, he has fought their physical avatars who could still make the trip from the physical world to the Dreamlands through sheer speed. Of course, they're slowly turning into their Dreamlands avatars as they're traveling through this, but in order to do that at all in any capacity would be your measurable speed, something that Nucleonics would scale to. And they do this not necessarily casually, but they're not like dying doing this either. So you would assume that would be enough to get an edge over Lordverse. He's never reacted to time travel levels of speed, right? Well, he hasn't, but characters he scales to have. He should be in a similar level of speed to characters like Space Godzilla when he's in his stronger states like Supercharged or Burning. Space Godzilla's faster than Mothra Leo, who can, well, time travel. And even characters weaker than Mothra Leo can travel infinite distance in the Godzilla cosmology pretty easily in finite time. So, off that alone, characters that are pretty much mid-tiers in speed in the Heisei era, as well as characters far lower down the line than Mothra Leo, such as the time-traveling birds from Orochi Headed Dragon, are all in these immeasurable speed categories. And Lordverse Godzilla should reasonably be faster than that, as we know a burning Lordverse Godzilla should be capable of reacting to Destroya, who is one of the fastest characters in the verse, despite not looking it. So when it comes to speed, though they can definitely keep up with each other and neither's getting necessarily blitzed, Lordverse has a noticeable edge, as Lordverse upscales characters on that level, whereas Nucleonics just kind of scales to them. Next we have physical strength, and for this one it's kind of debatable. Nucleonics is significantly larger than Lordverse, both in height and in weight. However, when it comes to their actual shellings, they're pretty comparable. Both have feats of basically shaking tectonic plates. Dagon was able to do a feat very similar to what Heisei Godzilla did, where he split a tectonic plate, and Nucleonics was able to basically match Angeria, who can shake entire tectonic plates through casual hits. So off physical strength, they seem relatively even for the most part. I mean, yes, technically speaking, if Dagon's feat was equal to Heisei Godzilla's, it was a more impressive feat overall, but Nucleonics was doing this rather casually. It wasn't like he was straining at all. So he could most likely replicate it, and now he could definitely replicate it. And they would both just kind of scale to their own attacks AP, as both of them could physically damage opponents that can take their own beams and stuff. So it would just be whoever wins power would also win physical strength for the most part. Or at the very least, striking strength. Lifting strength is far more debatable, but it wouldn't matter too much here, as they'd still be kind of relative. Do the similar feats. Next we have intelligence, and to be blunt, they draw. Both of them are pretty much as intelligent as a human despite being a kaiju. Both can understand human languages. Though Nucleonics isn't shown to quote-unquote talk like Lordverse is, kaiju do communicate in a very similar way in both verses, so it's reasonable to assume they're of pretty equal intelligence, and both can use weapons as well when given the chance, despite Nucleonics literally not having thumbs. So yeah, they're both pretty reasonably in the same intelligence tier. Neither is pulling a master plan and shocking the other one or anything, and both can be reckless or extremely intelligent depending on the circumstances. Which brings us to the next category, skill. Which one is more skilled? I'm also going to be factoring in experience here. Both have been fighting for pretty much decades now. Though Godzilla does have a slight experience edge in how long he's been fighting, as he is physically and mentally older than Nucleonics, he technically hasn't fought as many kaiju due to Nucleonics being sent out constantly in a verse that is far more infested with kaiju than the Lordverse is. Granted, when Lordverse does fight a kaiju, it's typically a kaiju at least somewhat comparable to himself, at the very least one that could damage him, whereas many of Nucleonics' victories were over pretty weak kaiju that couldn't do much. And he kind of just came in as the Superman of the verse and one-shotted, though he has definitely fought enemies on his level on multiple occasions. In fact, he's fought more enemies on his level than Lordverse has. He also didn't have anyone to train him. He was trained by humans who didn't really understand how his powers worked and were learning as he did. Whereas Lordverse had parents. He had a dad that he saw fight multiple times and probably learned a lot of his own abilities from, and he had a mom that is the same way. Sure, his dad did end up getting split in half by the Destroyer and killed, and his mom is currently in a coma, so he hasn't had training past that age there. He still had training from something similar to himself, so it's kind of unfair to say Nucleonics would just be more skilled because he's fought more, because he's still very noticeably not very good with his powers even to this day. He's still learning new things about his abilities, whereas Lordverse pretty much knows his skill set for the most part, and is only really learning new things when it's a new thing for his species as a whole. So for that, I think the safest bet is to say they're kind of even, generally speaking. Now for the next category, adaptability. Both can adapt to opponents far stronger than themselves and take damage from opponents far stronger than themselves. Godzilla should have durability roughly comparable to Destroya's in terms of how much damage he can take from an opponent stronger than himself, and Destroya was taking damage from burning Rozan. Though she obviously killed him and beat him pretty bad, burning Rozan is still so far above Destroya. Him even taking like a finger flick from her is incredibly impressive. Meaning Godzilla can endure hits from even a light form Nucleonics while he's in his base state. Though he could still technically be one-shot by a powerful enough attack, or killed from enough attacks, as, I mean, yeah, you could be super durable, but you're still fighting something stronger than yourself that's just as durable. He could still hang in there even at his weakest. And Nucleonics is the same way. He took attacks from Solar Hydro at his weakest state ever. His energy was basically depleted. He was essentially mentally destroyed at this point in the fight, and he was at his weakest state he's ever been, weaker than his juvenile form. And he was still taking attacks from beams that can one-shot an infinite multiverse. Yeah, each beam can do that. He was taking two at once. A multiverse that is 6th dimensional, mind you. So, yeah, they're roughly equal in durability. Even when Nucleonics is at his weakest, he can endure attacks from opponents of whole dimensionalities above where he's currently at. And in higher states, that durability scales with them. Though Godzilla's durability does also go up with his states, burning also kind of nerfs his durability by hurting himself. Regardless, though, they should be generally relative for most of the fight. And both can also adapt to things far stronger than themselves, with Godzilla being able to absorb energy from Nucleonics directly, as although Neo Gamma isn't energy in the tradition, it's not the same radiation Godzilla is used to absorbing. Other Godzillas have still absorbed higher dimensional energies, like Space Godzilla's Corona Beam, which is technically just a higher dimensional form of a cosmic ray. So yeah, he can absorb them. Just because they're not the standard radiation doesn't mean that Godzilla can't drain them. It's not like it even needs to be radiation. Other Godzillas like Heisei can just drain heat or souls. So yeah, and Nucleonics is the same way. Even if Godzilla's radiation was completely different, standard radiation he's used to absorbing, he can also, absorb magic and stuff, so it's not like he couldn't adapt to absorbing that. And Godzilla's directly connected to Lordverse, like Heisei, have been stated to be capable of adapting to absorbing magic as well. In a magazine about how he'd go about fighting Orochi, a dragon god that, is kind of overpowered. So, yeah, they could both adapt to each other's power sources, and they could both adapt to each other's strongest forms, with the light form being able to slowly rise in enough power to potentially match the burning state, while also being slightly more stable. Though, of course, this is a slower rise in power than the burning state gives Godzilla, and it can still prove just as dangerous as the burning state if he isn't careful. And Godzilla's burning form being able to just rapidly boost his power to match anything Nucleonics could throw at him. Of course, supercharged and hypercharged and all that also affect how the fight goes, but for the most part, they're just kind of continuously transforming like it's a Dragon Ball fight until one beats the other. Which brings us to our last and deciding factor, power. Which one's stronger? Well, Burning Godzilla, aka Lordverse's peak, is stronger than anything Nucleonics has, to be blunt. And in their base states, it's a little more complicated, but I'll get into it, I guess. Base Nucleonics is stronger than his Soul Fusion was when he fought Solardra. Solardra is an entity that was slightly stronger than Soul Fusion, so generally speaking, he should be roughly comparable to Solardra, if not slightly stronger. Maybe comparable to Cthulhu, but unlikely. Cthulhu's physical form, of course, not his true form, or his Dreamlands avatar. So, how powerful is Solardra or Cthulhu's physical form? Outside the whole being capable of destroying an infinite 60 multiverse thing, Solardra can technically rival stuff in the Dreamlands, just he's typically not doing that in his physical state. So at a high end, you could argue outer-versal levels of power, but I wouldn't, as, again, he typically needs Dreamland's energy to do that, and he's never done it in his physical form. Cthulhu, on the other hand, is blatantly above Solardra by a potentially infinite degree, meaning at the absolute best, he's either more layers into infinite 60, or potentially 70, or infinite 70. Somewhere in that general range. Nucleonics likely isn't comparable to this in his base form, but his hypercharged state or soul fusion state should be roughly on this level. And then once he hits his light form, he's likely stronger than Cthulhu. His physical state, of course. To what degree is unknown, but at best he can maybe get one dimensionality higher, meaning at the absolute maximum, Nucleonics as of right now could reach a level of around 8th dimensional to infinite 8th dimensional. Which is incredibly impressive, but not exactly Godzilla level. Godzilla in his base state, just like Nucleonics, has arguments of being anywhere from 5 to 7D. This is because we know he's somewhat comparable to Hasty Godzilla, who is at that exact level in his base state, depending on which point in the series we're talking about. Post-Space Godzilla, he's around 70. Pre-Space Godzilla, he's around 5D to maybe 60. So in base states, they're pretty comparable for the most part, with Godzilla still having that slight speed edge. Well, not really slight, but a speed edge. Moving on to their transformations, Supercharge would just be like Hypercharge. He doesn't really have an answer to Soul Fusion, I guess, but Burning versus Light is the real fight here. And in Burning form, Godzilla's power would be massively amped. We know that Burning in the Heisei era got an amp stronger than the Cosmic Amp. The Cosmic Amp was a whole dimensionality amp. So if it's stronger than that, it either means more layers into dimensionality or 2 dimensions. Meaning that Burning Godzilla is either 8D or 9D in base. And this would scale directly to Lordverse Godzilla's Burning form, as they're stated somewhat relative. And he's stated to be capable of fighting Destroyer for the most part, so there's that. With IHR, we don't know if it works like it does in the film, but if it does, this could get even higher. And for this, I assumed it did, because, well, how else would it work? At bare minimum, it's at least multiplying itself infinitely, to some degree, as it's the whole point of the move. Otherwise, it's just a fancy red spiral ray. Meaning that in terms of power, though both can adapt to each other and get stronger, Godzilla's going to have a pretty significant edge towards the latter half of the battle, once they get into their stronger forms. And the odds of him not making it to his burning state are very low, as again, he's not only faster, but can absorb energy from Nucleonics, whereas Nucleonics would struggle a lot more to get enough energy from Godzilla to do anything impressive. Ultimately, Nucleonics at best is around 8-dimensional to infinite 8D, and Godzilla is somewhere between 8 to 9, all the way up to over 12th dimensional. But what about light form? Light form can adapt to dimensions, right? Yes, but burning can just continuously amp itself up. Though there is a limit, the limit's more so about time, not raw energy. So Godzilla could just beam spam like an insane person, and so long as he releases the vast majority of that energy, he could technically still survive the form. And even if he killed Nucleonics before Meltdown, that would still count as a win here. So, ultimately, though Nucleonics does have win cons, he could potentially adapt to burning under the right circumstances if he's given enough time and Godzilla makes enough mistakes, or if he plays it smart enough. He isn't reliably able to counter burning enough times for me to comfortably say he wins the majority of the time. Meaning that if you ran this fight over 100 times, I'd say he wins about 45 times out of 100, with Godzilla winning 55% of the time. The winner is Lordverse Godzilla. This was certainly a pretty complex matchup. Both of them had counters to a lot of each other's stuff, and their stats were generally even up until their transformations got involved. However, it's not quite as complex as the next matchup is, as that one, oh boy, was that one a struggle to figure out. Anyways, if you liked the video, please consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.
Oh, I'm scared. Domain expansion. Infinite void.